John Stuart Mill remains one of the most influential philosophers and political thinkers of the 19th century. His ideas on liberty, utilitarianism, democracy, and economic theory have shaped modern political thought and continue to influence debates on individual freedom and social justice. Mill was a remarkable intellectual whose works transcended his time, leaving a lasting impact on philosophy, economics, and political theory. His contributions to liberalism and utilitarianism set the foundation for many contemporary discussions on rights, governance, and ethical decision-making. Born in 1806 in London, Mill was raised in an environment that fostered intellectual rigor. From an early age, he was exposed to the works of classical thinkers such as Aristotle, Plato, and Adam Smith. His father, James Mill, an economist and philosopher himself, aimed to mold his son into a great intellectual capable of advancing the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. This strict and intensive education played a crucial role in shaping John Stuart Mill's analytical skills and commitment to rational inquiry. His early exposure to a broad range of disciplines allowed him to develop a comprehensive worldview, which later translated into his influential writings. One of the defining aspects of Mill's intellectual legacy is his defense of individual liberty. In his seminal work on liberty, 1859, he argued for the importance of personal freedom, stating that individuals should be free to act as they wish, provided they do not harm others. This idea, known as the harm principle, became a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. Mill believed that society's progress depended on the ability of individuals to express themselves freely and challenge dominant opinions. His vision of liberty was not merely a call for personal independence, but also a framework for a well-functioning and just society. Beyond his work on liberty, Mill made significant contributions to utilitarianism, a moral and political philosophy that seeks to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. While he followed Bentham's foundational ideas, Mill introduced a crucial distinction between higher and lower pleasures, arguing that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to mere physical satisfaction. This refinement of utilitarian ethics aimed to promote a more enlightened and meaningful approach to human well-being, differentiating his version of utilitarianism from the more simplistic hedonism of his predecessors. In addition to his philosophical contributions, Mill was a strong advocate for social and political reform. He was deeply concerned with issues such as democracy, freedom of speech, and economic justice. His ideas on representative government, detailed in Considerations on Representative Government, 1861, emphasized the need for an informed and educated electorate. He argued that democratic institutions should not only be about majority rule, but should also protect minority rights and encourage public deliberation. His belief in the importance of rational discussion and informed decision-making remains highly relevant in today's political climate. A lesser-known but equally significant aspect of Mill's legacy is his advocacy for gender equality. In the Subjection of Women, 1869, he made a groundbreaking argument for women's rights, challenging the traditional patriarchal structures of his time. Mill's call for equal education and political participation for women was considered radical in the 19th century but laid the intellectual groundwork for later feminist movements. His commitment to justice extended beyond gender, as he also spoke against social and economic inequalities, advocating for policies that would create a fairer society. Economically, Mill was a progressive thinker who recognized both the benefits and limitations of free markets. While he supported economic liberalism, he also acknowledged the dangers of unchecked capitalism, particularly the exploitation of workers and the concentration of wealth. In Principles of Political Economy, 1848, he explored ideas that would later influence welfare economics, arguing for the need to balance market freedoms with social responsibility. His economic theories anticipated many of the debates that continue today regarding wealth distribution, labor rights, and government intervention in the economy. Despite the breadth of his intellectual contributions, Mill's legacy is not without controversy. Some critics argue that his ideas, while progressive for his time, still carried certain limitations, particularly in terms of cultural relativism and the extent of state intervention in personal freedoms. Others point out that his commitment to utilitarianism sometimes conflicted with his advocacy for individual rights, raising important philosophical tensions in his work. Nonetheless, his writings remain essential reading for those interested in political theory, ethics, and social philosophy. The significance of Mill's ideas extends far beyond the 19th century. His thoughts on liberty, democracy, utilitarianism, and economic justice continue to shape modern discussions on governance, human rights, and morality. Contemporary debates on freedom of speech, government regulation, and personal autonomy often reference his works, demonstrating the enduring relevance of his philosophy. His intellectual contributions continue to serve as a guide for policymakers, activists, and scholars seeking to balance individual freedoms with collective well-being. John Stuart Mill was born on May 20th, 1806, in London, into an environment of intense intellectual discipline and high expectations. His father, James Mill, was a Scottish philosopher, historian, and economist, known for his association with the utilitarian thinker Jeremy Bentham. James Mill believed in the power of education to shape a person's destiny, and from the moment of John's birth, he meticulously designed a rigorous educational program for his son. Unlike most children who spent their early years in play and social interaction, John was immersed in a structured world of books, logic, and rigorous intellectual challenges. From the age of 3, John Stuart Mill was introduced to classical literature and history. His father taught him Greek before he even learned English fluently, ensuring that he could read and comprehend original texts from philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Herodotus. By the age of 8, he had mastered Latin and was reading works by Virgil and Cicero. His studies were not limited to languages. He also explored mathematics, logic, and political economy, absorbing complex ideas at a pace far beyond what was expected of a child his age. The young Mill was not just memorizing information. His father encouraged him to analyze, critique, and debate the ideas he encountered. This intensive education was not a product of indulgent parental ambition, but rather a calculated experiment. James Mill believed that if his son could be trained to think critically and reason logically from an early age, he would grow into a powerful intellectual force. He did not allow distractions or emotional indulgences in his son's upbringing, emphasizing rationality above all else. This approach produced astonishing results. By the age of 12, John Stuart Mill had read the works of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and was well-versed in economic theory. Unlike other children who might have struggled with abstract economic principles, Mill was already engaging in discussions on free markets, taxation, and political structures with some of the greatest thinkers of the time. Despite the apparent success of this rigorous education, it came at a cost. Mill's childhood was devoid of traditional play, social interactions with children his own age, or the simple joys of an unstructured life. His father discouraged any engagement with religious teachings, ensuring that Mill grew up with a strictly secular and rationalist worldview. The absence of emotional nurturing and social experiences would later play a significant role in shaping his adult life, leading to periods of intense introspection and even emotional crisis. While intellectually superior to his peers, he lacked the warmth and carefree spirit typical of childhood. One of the most significant influences on Mill's early education was the philosophy of utilitarianism. Under his father's guidance, and in close association with Jeremy Bentham, Mill became deeply acquainted with the principles of maximizing happiness and reducing suffering. Bentham's radical ideas on law, governance, and morality fascinated young Mill, who eagerly absorbed his ideas. However, rather than accepting them uncritically, Mill was encouraged to refine and challenge them, demonstrating an early independence of thought. In addition to philosophy and economics, Mill's education included extensive training in logic and scientific reasoning. He studied Euclidean geometry, astronomy, and chemistry, ensuring that he developed a disciplined and systematic way of thinking. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied on rote learning, Mill's education emphasized reasoning, analysis, and synthesis. His father's goal was to create a mind that could dissect and reconstruct ideas with precision, free from the biases and traditions that often clouded judgment. This scientific and analytical approach would later shape Mill's contributions to philosophy, particularly in his writings on logic and empiricism. One of the few positive aspects of Mill's intense upbringing was the exposure to some of the greatest intellectual minds of his time. James Mill's close relationship with the utilitarian circle meant that John was frequently in the company of leading philosophers, economists, and political theorists. He listened to debates on governance, ethics, and economics from an early age, gaining firsthand experience in the art of argumentation. These discussions not only broadened his intellectual horizons, but also instilled in him a lifelong commitment to critical inquiry and public discourse. However, the burden of such an intense education became apparent in his teenage years. While his intellect flourished, his emotional and psychological well-being suffered. At the age of 20, Mill experienced what he later described as a profound mental crisis. The years of intellectual pressure, combined with a lack of emotional support and personal freedom, led to feelings of emptiness and disillusionment. He began to question whether all his knowledge and achievements had any real purpose. This crisis marked a turning point in his life and forced him to seek a more balanced perspective, one that would eventually lead him to develop a more humanistic and nuanced version of utilitarianism. Despite the challenges he faced, Mill's early education laid the foundation for his future intellectual contributions. His ability to analyze complex political and philosophical issues with clarity and depth was a direct result of his rigorous training. However, as he matured, he recognized the limitations of his upbringing. While it had equipped him with formidable analytical skills, it had neglected the emotional and creative aspects of human experience. This realization would later influence his philosophical work, as he sought to integrate logic with empathy, reason with emotion, and knowledge with personal fulfillment. John Stuart Mill's intellectual development was shaped by an intricate web of influences that extended far beyond the rigorous education imposed by his father. While his early years were dominated by the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham and the rationalist doctrines of James Mill, his mind was not confined to a single school of thought. As he grew older, Mill began to explore a broader spectrum of philosophical traditions, literary works, and political theories, refining his ideas through engagement with a variety of perspectives. This intellectual expansion would be instrumental in shaping his later contributions to philosophy, ethics, and political theory. One of the earliest and most significant influences on Mill was Jeremy Bentham, whose utilitarianism provided the foundation for his moral and political thinking. Bentham's principle of maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering struck a deep chord with Mill, and he initially accepted it as an unassailable truth. However, as Mill matured, he recognized the limitations of Bentham's strictly quantitative approach to morality. Bentham's utilitarianism treated all pleasures as equal, focusing solely on their measurable consequences. Mill, however, would come to argue that intellectual and moral pleasures were inherently superior to mere physical gratification, marking one of his key departures from Benthamite thought. In addition to Bentham, Mill was profoundly influenced by the works of the British empiricists, particularly John Locke, David Hume, and George Berkeley. Their emphasis on experience, observation, and rational inquiry resonated with Mill's analytical mindset. Locke's theory of the mind as a blank slate reinforced Mill's belief in the power of education and social conditioning, while Hume's skepticism encouraged him to question absolute truths and seek evidence-based reasoning. These thinkers provided Mill with a framework for understanding human cognition, morality, and knowledge, which he would later refine in his own philosophical writings. As Mill entered adulthood, his exposure to continental European philosophy introduced him to new dimensions of thought that would significantly broaden his intellectual landscape. One of the most transformative encounters in his intellectual journey was with the German philosopher Wilhelm von Humboldt, whose ideas on individuality and self-development deeply influenced on liberty. Humboldt's argument that personal growth and intellectual diversity were essential for a flourishing society resonated with Mill, leading him to refine his own vision of liberty as not merely the absence of coercion, but as the active cultivation of human potential. Equally important to Mill's intellectual development was his engagement with the works of French thinkers such as Alexis de Tocqueville and Auguste Comte. Tocqueville's analysis of democracy in America made a lasting impression on Mill, particularly in its discussion of the potential dangers of majority rule and the tyranny of public opinion. Mill recognized the need for democratic institutions to be tempered by protections for individual rights and minority voices, an idea that would become central to his later political writings. His relationship with Kant, the founder of positivism, was more complex. While he admired Kant's emphasis on scientific reasoning and social progress, he found his rigid vision of a technocratic society overly deterministic and authoritarian. Literature and poetry also played a crucial role in shaping Mill's intellectual and emotional outlook. His early education had largely neglected the humanities in favor of logic and political economy. But during a period of deep personal crisis in his 20s, he turned to literature for solace and inspiration. The works of William Wordsworth, in particular, had a profound impact on him. Wordsworth's poetry emphasized the beauty of nature, the importance of emotions, and the spiritual aspects of human experience, elements that have been largely absent from Mill's strictly rationalist upbringing. This encounter with Romanticism helped Mill integrate a more humanistic and empathetic dimension into his philosophical outlook. Another crucial influence in Mill's life was Harriet Taylor, a writer and intellectual with whom he developed a deep personal and philosophical relationship. Taylor was not only his confidant, but also his intellectual equal, and their discussions helped refine many of Mill's ideas on individual freedom, equality, and social justice. Their collaboration was particularly influential in shaping his views on gender equality, which would later be fully articulated in the subjection of women. Through his relationship with Taylor, Mill came to appreciate the importance of emotional intelligence, personal relationships, and the role of women's agency in shaping a just society. Mill's engagement with historical thinkers also played a significant role in his development. He studied the works of Aristotle, particularly his ethical theories, which emphasized the cultivation of virtue and rational deliberation in human life. He also drew inspiration from John Milton's defense of free speech and the importance of open debate in society. The combination of classical philosophy, empirical reasoning, romantic literature, and contemporary political thought helped Mill develop a nuanced and sophisticated worldview, one that balanced rational inquiry with moral and emotional depth. Despite his exposure to a wide range of ideas, Mill never became dogmatic in his beliefs. Instead, he embraced intellectual pluralism, constantly refining his theories through critical engagement with opposing viewpoints. He believed that truth could only emerge through the clash of ideas, and he championed open debate as the foundation of progress. His method of thinking was not one of rigid adherence to a single doctrine, but of continual self-examination and evolution. This commitment to intellectual flexibility would later define his approach to liberalism and democratic governance. By the time John Stuart Mill reached his early 20s, he had already established himself as a prodigy of intellectual achievement. His education had been more intense and extensive than that of most scholars twice his age, and his mind had been trained in logic, philosophy, economics, and political theory. Yet, despite his unparalleled knowledge and intellectual discipline, Mill found himself facing an unexpected and deeply unsettling personal crisis, one that would shake the very foundations of his worldview and force him to reevaluate his entire approach to life. This period of existential turmoil, often referred to as his mental crisis, marked a turning point in his personal and intellectual development. The crisis emerged gradually, but became most acute in 1826, when Mill was around 20 years old. One day, as he was going about his usual intellectual routine, a question occurred to him with unexpected force. If all the reforms and social changes I am working for were accomplished, would I be happy? The answer, to his great dismay, was no. This realization struck him with profound despair. He had devoted his life to the principles of utilitarianism, believing that the pursuit of the greatest happiness for the greatest number was the ultimate goal. Yet, when faced with the prospect of achieving that goal, he found that it brought him no personal fulfillment or meaning. For years, Mill had been trained to think rationally, to analyze the world through logic and utility. But in this moment, he recognized a deep void within himself. He had been taught to prioritize reason over emotion, calculation over spontaneity, and intellectual mastery over personal fulfillment. Now, he realized that something essential had been neglected in his upbringing, his own emotional well-being. He described his condition as one of numbness, a state in which nothing could bring him joy or comfort. The very values he had been trained to uphold now seemed hollow, devoid of the personal satisfaction he had unconsciously assumed they would bring. Mill's crisis was not merely an intellectual dilemma, but an existential one. He had been raised in a world where logic and reason dictated everything, yet he now found himself unable to reason his way out of his emotional suffering. The more he analyzed his condition, the more paralyzed he became. He felt as though all his achievements and knowledge had been in vain, that his rigorous education had prepared him for an abstract world of ideas, but had failed to equip him for the realities of human experience. He had been shaped into a brilliant thinker, but he lacked the tools to navigate the complexities of his own emotions. During this dark period, Mill withdrew from much of his usual intellectual activity, consumed by a sense of inner emptiness. He questioned whether life had any meaning beyond the pursuit of abstract ideals. For a time, he even contemplated whether life was worth living at all. The strict utilitarian framework he had inherited from Bentham and his father had offered a rational explanation for morality and social organization, but it had failed to provide him with a personal sense of purpose. He began to see the limitations of a purely utilitarian philosophy, one that measured happiness in terms of external utility rather than internal fulfillment. It was during this period of despair that Mill found solace in an unexpected source: poetry. Up until this point, he had regarded literature and the arts as secondary to the more serious disciplines of logic, economics, and political philosophy. However, in his search for meaning, he turned to the works of William Wordsworth, whose poetry spoke to the very aspects of life that Mill had long ignored: emotion, beauty, and the deep connection between the individual and nature. Wordsworth's reflections on the human experience, his appreciation for the quiet joys of life, and his sensitivity to emotional depth resonated deeply with Mill, offering him a path out of his despondency. Through Wordsworth, Mill came to understand that happiness was not simply a matter of maximizing pleasure or minimizing suffering, but also of cultivating emotional richness and personal meaning. He realized that his father's education had given him the tools to analyze the world, but had left him emotionally underdeveloped. The arts, he now recognized, played an essential role in shaping the human soul, providing the depth and warmth that strict rationalism lacked. This realization marked a significant transformation in his philosophy, one that would later lead him to modify utilitarianism to include qualitative distinctions between different forms of happiness. As he slowly emerged from his crisis, Mill began to explore other forms of self-expression and emotional development. He sought out literature, music, and personal relationships as sources of fulfillment. His crisis had taught him that the human experience was not something to be reduced to logical formulas, but something to be felt, lived, and deeply engaged with. The rigid intellectual framework he had inherited was no longer sufficient. He needed to integrate emotional and aesthetic appreciation into his worldview. This period of emotional awakening also led Mill to reassess his views on individual development and personal freedom. He came to believe that true liberty was not just the absence of external constraints, but also the ability to cultivate one's inner life. He saw that people needed space not only to think and act freely, but also to experience, reflect, and grow emotionally. This insight would later become a crucial part of his work on liberty, where he defended the importance of individuality and self-expression as essential components of human flourishing. By the time he emerged from his mental crisis, Mill was no longer the same person he had been before. He had moved beyond the rigid utilitarianism of his upbringing and embraced a more complex, holistic understanding of happiness, one that included intellectual pursuits, emotional depth, and artistic appreciation. His personal struggles had reshaped his philosophy, making him more attuned to the subtleties of human experience. This transformation would inform much of his later work, giving it a depth and richness that set it apart from the purely analytical philosophies of his predecessors. Among the most significant relationships in John Stuart Mill's life was his deep intellectual and emotional bond with Harriet Taylor. Their meeting in 1830 marked the beginning of a partnership that would profoundly shape Mill's philosophical outlook, particularly his views on liberty, equality, and the role of women in society. While Mill had already begun to expand beyond the rigid utilitarianism of his early years, it was Harriet who helped him refine his thoughts on social justice, personal freedom, and the emotional aspects of human life. Their connection was not merely one of affection, but of shared ideals and mutual intellectual influence. Harriet Taylor was an extraordinary woman for her time, well-read, intellectually sharp, and deeply committed to the cause of women's rights. Born in 1807, she had received an education that, while not as rigorous as Mill's, was far superior to what most women of her era had access to. She was known for her independent spirit and keen analytical mind, qualities that attracted Mill when they were introduced. At the time of their meeting, Harriet was married to John Taylor, a prosperous pharmacist, but she and Mill quickly formed an intense emotional and intellectual connection. Their relationship was unconventional and controversial. In Victorian England, where strict social norms governed marriage and personal conduct, their close association drew considerable scrutiny. Although Harriet and Mill insisted that their bond was primarily intellectual during the years of her marriage, their deep emotional connection was undeniable. The scandal surrounding their friendship did not deter them, and they continued to exchange ideas, correspond extensively, and discuss matters of philosophy, politics, and social reform. Harriet's husband tolerated their association, and Mill's devotion to her only grew stronger over time. Harriet Taylor's influence on Mill's thought was profound. She challenged him to think more deeply about issues of justice, gender equality, and the moral dimensions of personal relationships. While Mill had always been an advocate for progress and rational reform, Harriet pushed him to recognize the injustices that women faced in a patriarchal society. Through their conversations, Mill came to see that gender inequality was not just a social issue, but a fundamental moral failing, one that required systemic change. This realization would later culminate in his groundbreaking work, The Subjection of Women, in which he argued for the full legal and social equality of women. Beyond her impact on his political thought, Harriet also helped Mill refine his views on individuality and personal freedom. She emphasized the importance of self-development, arguing that true happiness came not only from external social reform, but also from the cultivation of one's own unique potential. This idea resonated deeply with Mill, who had already begun to explore the value of personal expression following his mental crisis. Harriet's perspective reinforced his belief that liberty was not just about freedom from government interference, but about the ability to live authentically and pursue personal growth. One of the key intellectual projects that Mill and Harriet collaborated on was On Liberty. Although the final published work bore only Mill's name, he credited Harriet as an equal contributor, describing the book as jointly our production. Her ideas on individual sovereignty, the dangers of social conformity, and the importance of free thought were deeply embedded in the text. The central argument of On Liberty, that individuals should be free to act as they wish, provided they do not harm others, was influenced by their shared belief in the necessity of both personal and societal progress. Harriet's influence extended beyond political philosophy into Mill's ethical thought. While his early education had focused on Benthamite utilitarianism, With its emphasis on maximizing overall happiness, Harriet encouraged him to consider a more qualitative approach to well-being. This shift in perspective became evident in his later works, where he distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, arguing that intellectual and moral fulfillment were superior to mere physical gratification. It was a perspective that blended utilitarian logic with a more humanistic appreciation for individual dignity and emotional depth. After Harriet's husband passed away in 1849, she and Mill were finally able to marry in 1851. Their marriage was a continuation of their long-standing intellectual partnership, and Mill regarded Harriet not just as his wife, but as his equal in philosophical discourse. Unfortunately, their time together as a married couple was short-lived. Harriet died of a severe respiratory illness in 1858, just 7 years after their wedding. Her death was a devastating blow to Mill, who mourned her loss deeply and spent much of the rest of his life honoring her intellectual legacy. In the years that followed Harriet's death, Mill dedicated himself to advancing the causes they had both championed. He became one of the most vocal advocates for women's rights in Britain, using his position as a member of Parliament to push for legal reforms that would grant women the right to vote, own property, and participate fully in public life. His tireless efforts in this area were a testament to the lasting impact Harriet had on his thinking. She had not only inspired him to advocate for gender equality, but had also provided him with the intellectual foundation to articulate these ideas persuasively. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, published in 1859, stands as one of the most enduring and influential works of political philosophy ever written. This seminal text was not just an academic treatise, but a passionate defense of individual freedom in an era where the forces of conformity, social pressure, and governmental authority threatened to suppress human potential. Mill's arguments in On Liberty were shaped by his lifelong intellectual journey, his personal struggles with emotional growth, and the deep philosophical discussions he shared with Harriet Taylor. At its core, the book championed the idea that true progress and happiness could only be achieved through the full and unrestricted development of individual character. The foundation of On Liberty was Mill's famous harm principle, which proposed that the only justifiable reason for restricting an individual's freedom was to prevent harm to others. In other words, society and the state had no legitimate authority to interfere with a person's actions unless those actions directly caused harm to someone else. This principle was revolutionary because it challenged both government overreach and the subtler, more insidious ways that societal norms could suppress personal expression. Mill feared not only the tyranny of political rulers, but also the tyranny of the majority, a concept he borrowed and expanded upon from Alexis de Tocqueville's observations of democracy. Mill recognized that democratic institutions, while necessary for justice and equality, could sometimes lead to a dangerous form of conformity. Public opinion, he argued, could become an oppressive force, punishing individuals who held unconventional beliefs or pursued unorthodox ways of life. He saw this in Victorian England, where rigid moral standards and social expectations often stifled creativity, innovation, and intellectual debate. He warned that when societies become intolerant of dissenting voices, they risk stagnation, as progress depends on the continuous questioning of established norms. A major theme of On Liberty was the importance of free speech. Mill argued that no idea, no matter how widely accepted, should be considered immune from scrutiny. He believed that even incorrect or offensive opinions had value because they forced society to continually test and refine its own beliefs. Without open discussion and debate, truth itself could become distorted and widely accepted ideas could go unchallenged, leading to intellectual complacency. He pointed out that many beliefs once considered absolute, such as the justifications for slavery or the subjugation of women, have been proven wrong precisely because of the ability to challenge them over time. Furthermore, Mill stressed that the suppression of an opinion robs society of the chance to either correct a false belief or strengthen a true one. He argued that if an opinion is wrong, its exposure to debate will help refine the truth. Conversely, if it is correct, then challenging it allows people to understand why it is true rather than accepting it blindly. This perspective was particularly radical in a time when many governments and religious institutions sought to control public discourse through censorship and moral dogma. Beyond the realm of free speech, On Liberty also made a passionate case for individuality and personal development. Mill believed that people should be free to pursue their own paths in life, even if their choices seemed unconventional or unpopular. He viewed individuality as essential for both personal happiness and societal advancement. To Mill, a society that discouraged experimentation and diversity of thought risked becoming stagnant, whereas one that allowed individuals to explore their full potential would flourish intellectually, artistically, and morally. He also recognized that people often conformed to societal expectations not out of true belief, but out of fear of social rejection. This, he argued, was one of the greatest threats to personal freedom. He urged individuals to resist the pressure to conform and to cultivate their own unique talents, interests, and ways of thinking. In his view, a person's character could only develop through genuine self-expression and the pursuit of knowledge, rather than blind adherence to tradition or authority. Mill's vision of liberty was not without its limits. He was careful to distinguish between self-regarding actions, those that affected only the individual, and other-regarding actions, those that affected others. While he fiercely defended the right to individual self-determination, he acknowledged that society had a legitimate interest in preventing harm. For example, he argued that people should be free to make their own choices, even if they were risky or self-destructive, but they should not be allowed to engage in behaviors that actively harmed others, such as fraud, violence, or coercion. Although On Liberty was initially met with mixed reactions, its influence grew over time. Many conservatives of the era found Mill's arguments unsettling, as they challenged traditional authority and social norms. On the other hand, many reformers embraced his ideas as a powerful defense of human dignity and individual rights. In the decades that followed, Mill's work became a foundational text for liberal political thought, influencing movements for free speech, civil liberties, and democratic governance around the world. Today, On Liberty remains one of the most widely studied and debated works in political philosophy. Its warnings against the dangers of societal conformity, censorship, and government overreach continue to be relevant in modern discussions about free expression, privacy, and personal autonomy. Mill's insistence that individuals should be allowed to think, speak, and live as they choose, so long as they do not harm others, has shaped countless legal and political debates on human rights. His legacy endures in the continued struggle for freedom in societies that seek to balance security, morality, and individual self-determination. By the time John Stuart Mill entered political life, his reputation as a philosopher and public intellectual had already been firmly established. His works on liberty, utilitarianism, and political economy had made him one of the most respected thinkers of his generation. However, Mill was not content with simply shaping ideas from the outside. He wanted to bring his principles into action. In 1865, he was elected as a Member of Parliament, MP, for Westminster, a position that allowed him to put his theories into practice and directly influence British policy. Though his time in Parliament was brief, lasting only until 1868, it was a period of intense political engagement, during which he championed progressive causes that were far ahead of his time. Mill entered Parliament as an independent liberal, refusing to align himself strictly with any political party. He saw himself as a representative of reasoned debate and moral progress, rather than of narrow partisan interests. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not seek power for its own sake. Instead, he used his position as a platform to advocate for reforms that he believed would create a more just and equitable society. His primary concerns included expanding democracy, improving education, protecting individual rights, and addressing social inequalities, particularly those affecting women and the working class. One of Mill's most radical and controversial positions as an MP was his advocacy for women's suffrage. At a time when even many reformers hesitated to support women's right to vote, Mill took a firm stand in favor of gender equality. In 1866, he presented a petition to Parliament demanding that women be granted the same voting rights as men. This was the first formal attempt to introduce women's suffrage into British politics, and though it was rejected, it marked a turning point in the movement for gender equality. Mill's arguments laid the intellectual foundation for the later suffragist campaigns that would ultimately lead to women gaining the right to vote. Beyond suffrage, Mill also fought for broader legal and social reforms to improve the status of women. He argued that marriage laws should be reformed to ensure that women had equal legal standing with their husbands, particularly in matters of property and personal freedom. At the time, married women had few legal rights of their own, often being considered the property of their husbands. Mill's insistence on equal rights was deeply influenced by his relationship with Harriet Taylor, whose ideas on gender justice had shaped his thinking. He believed that true democracy was impossible without the full participation of women, and he continued to challenge the deep-seated biases that kept them in subjugation. Another major focus of Mill's political career was the expansion of the franchise to the working class. He supported extending voting rights beyond the upper classes, arguing that democracy should be inclusive rather than restricted to the wealthy and educated elite. However, Mill also believed that an effective democracy required an informed and engaged electorate. To balance these concerns, he proposed a system of plural voting, in which individuals with higher levels of education or expertise would receive more votes than those with less formal education. This idea was controversial and is rarely supported today, but at the time, it reflected Mill's concern about balancing democracy with intellectual and moral responsibility. Mill was also a strong advocate for free speech and press freedom within Parliament. He believed that open debate was the foundation of a healthy democracy and warned against any attempts to suppress political dissent. His speeches frequently emphasized the importance of diverse opinions and the need for Parliament to reflect the interests of all citizens, not just those of the privileged classes. He often spoke against government overreach and was critical of policies that restricted individual liberties, arguing that a just society could only function if people were free to express their thoughts and challenge prevailing ideas. Beyond civil rights and democratic reforms, Mill also focused on economic policies aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. While he accepted some of the principles of classical economic liberalism, he rejected the idea that the free market alone could solve all social problems. He supported policies that promoted education, fair wages, and land reform to prevent excessive concentration of wealth. He also argued that workers should have greater control over their own labor, advocating for cooperative businesses in which employees had a stake in decision-making. His views foreshadowed later debates on economic justice and labor rights. Another area in which Mill played an important role was colonial policy and international justice. He was deeply critical of the ways in which Britain and other European powers exploited their colonies, and he called for a more ethical approach to governance. Although he initially supported some aspects of imperialism, believing that European influence could help civilize colonized nations, he later grew more skeptical of colonial rule, recognizing that true progress could only come through self-governance and cultural respect. His later writings reflect a growing awareness of the need for autonomy and dignity in colonized societies. Despite his many contributions, Mill's tenure in Parliament was not without its challenges. His progressive views often put him at odds with more conservative politicians, and his intellectual approach to politics sometimes made him seem detached from the realities of parliamentary maneuvering. He was never a charismatic politician in the traditional sense, preferring reasoned debate over populist rhetoric. This, combined with the unpopularity of some of his ideas, especially women's suffrage and plural voting, led to his defeat in the 1868 election. Though disappointed, Mill remained committed to his principles and continued to write and advocate for social reform in the years that followed. Although his time in Parliament was short, its impact was significant. Mill's efforts helped push forward debates on democratic inclusion, gender equality, and social justice. Many of the causes he championed, women's suffrage, workers' rights, and education reform, would later become central to political progress in Britain and beyond. His influence extended far beyond the legislative chamber, shaping the philosophical foundations of liberal democracy for generations to come. One of John Stuart Mill's most groundbreaking contributions to social and political thought was his uncompromising advocacy for gender equality, which he articulated most forcefully in his 1869 work, The Subjection of Women. At a time when women were legally, socially, and economically subordinate to men, Mill's arguments were revolutionary. He did not merely call for reforms to improve women's condition. He demanded their full and equal participation in society. His views were shaped by both his philosophical beliefs in liberty and justice and his deep intellectual partnership with Harriet Taylor, whose influence on his feminist thought was profound. In The Subjection of Women, Mill argued that the inferior position of women was not a natural condition, but a product of historical oppression. He compared women's status in society to that of slaves, emphasizing that their subjugation was maintained not by force alone, but also by deeply ingrained cultural and legal norms. He noted that throughout history, men had used their greater physical strength, social privileges, and legal power to suppress women's independence and opportunities. Unlike many of his contemporaries who believed that biological differences justified gender roles, Mill maintained that such differences were largely irrelevant when it came to matters of justice and individual capability. A key argument in Mill's work was that women's talents and intellectual potential had been systematically suppressed. He believed that because women had been denied access to education, professional careers, and political participation, society had never truly seen what they were capable of achieving. If given the same opportunities as men, he argued, women could excel in every field: science, literature, politics, business, and philosophy. He warned that by keeping women confined to domestic life, society was depriving itself of half of its potential genius and innovation. Mill was particularly critical of marriage laws, which, in his view, placed women in a state of legal and economic dependence on their husbands. At the time, a married woman had few rights of her own. Her property, earnings, and even personal freedoms were legally controlled by her husband. Mill described this arrangement as a form of domestic tyranny, in which women were expected to obey their husbands in all matters. He advocated for marriage based on equality, in which both partners had mutual rights and responsibilities. He also supported changes to property laws that would allow women to own and manage their own wealth, rather than being entirely dependent on their husbands. Another of Mill's radical proposals was women's access to professional and educational opportunities. He argued that women should not be limited to roles as wives and mothers, but should have the freedom to pursue careers in law, medicine, academia, and public service. At the time, most universities and professions were closed to women, reinforcing the idea that their primary function was to care for the home and children. Mill saw this restriction as both unjust and economically wasteful. He believed that the inclusion of women in the workforce would not only benefit them individually, but would also contribute to greater national prosperity by increasing productivity and innovation. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the subjection of women was Mill's insistence on women's right to vote and participate in politics. His views on women's suffrage were among the most progressive of his era. As an MP, he had already attempted to introduce a proposal for women's voting rights in Parliament, only to face strong opposition. In The Subjection of Women, he expanded on his arguments, asserting that a truly democratic society could not exist while half of its population remained politically voiceless. He saw women's exclusion from politics as an irrational contradiction, given that many women were just as intelligent and capable as men. Mill also addressed social attitudes and cultural biases that kept women in a subordinate position. He observed that many women, having been raised in a society that conditioned them to accept inferiority, had internalized their own oppression. He noted that the very idea of femininity had been constructed in a way that encouraged submission, obedience, and self-sacrifice. Women were taught to see their highest virtue as serving others, husbands, children, and family, rather than pursuing their own ambitions. Mill argued that this cultural conditioning had to change if true equality was to be achieved. Despite its radical nature, the subjection of women was met with a mixture of admiration and fierce criticism. Many conservatives and traditionalists dismissed Mill's ideas as unrealistic or even dangerous, believing that women's roles were naturally confined to the domestic sphere. Others, including some who supported limited reforms for women's rights, thought his demands for full equality went too far. However, among progressives and early feminists, the book was widely celebrated. It became an intellectual cornerstone for the women's suffrage movement in Britain, the United States, and beyond. One of the reasons Mill's arguments were so powerful was that they were based on rationality rather than sentimentality. Unlike some defenders of women's rights who framed their arguments in terms of moral duty or religious principles, Mill approached the issue from a philosophical and utilitarian perspective. He showed that gender inequality was not only unjust, but also harmful to society as a whole. By excluding women from public life, the world was depriving itself of immense potential talent and intelligence. Though Mill did not live to see the full realization of his feminist ideals, his work laid the groundwork for the future success of the women's rights movement. Decades later, many of the reforms he advocated, such as women's right to vote, own property, and enter the workforce, became realities. His arguments remain relevant in contemporary discussions of gender equality, influencing modern debates on workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, and political representation. John Stuart Mill's contributions to political economy were as significant as his work in philosophy and political theory. As one of the most influential economic thinkers of the 19th century, Mill sought to refine and expand the principles of classical economics while addressing its limitations in promoting social welfare. His most comprehensive economic work, Principles of Political Economy, 1848, became a foundational text for students, policymakers, and economists alike. Unlike many of his predecessors, Mill did not see economic laws as rigid and unchangeable. Rather, he believed they could be shaped to create a more just and equitable society. One of Mill's key economic arguments was the distinction between the laws of production and the laws of distribution. He accepted that certain economic principles, such as the role of labor, capital, and technological progress in production, were largely determined by natural laws. However, he insisted that the distribution of wealth was a matter of human design and could be modified through policies and social reforms. This perspective set him apart from classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who largely assumed that economic outcomes were dictated by impersonal market forces. Mill's views on private property and land reform were particularly innovative. While he defended private property as an important institution, he was deeply concerned about the concentration of land ownership and the economic inequality it produced. He criticized the practice of absentee landlords profiting from land without contributing to its cultivation or improvement. In response, he proposed a system of land taxation that would prevent excessive accumulation of wealth among landowners while ensuring that the land was used efficiently and productively. His ideas foreshadowed later debates on land reform and economic justice. One of the most progressive aspects of Mill's economic thought was his support for cooperative enterprises and worker ownership. He was critical of the hierarchical structure of traditional capitalist enterprises, where profits were concentrated in the hands of a few owners while workers remained powerless. Instead, he envisioned a future where businesses were run as cooperatives, in which workers had a direct stake in management and profits. He believed this system would not only promote economic fairness, but also encourage a stronger sense of responsibility and productivity among workers. His support for cooperative models influenced later labor movements and socialist thinkers. Mill also addressed the problem of poverty and inequality, arguing that unchecked capitalism often led to the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few while leaving the majority in precarious economic conditions. Unlike some classical economists who believed that poverty was an inevitable byproduct of economic development, Mill saw it as a solvable problem. He advocated for government intervention in certain areas, such as education, public health, and housing, to improve living conditions for the poor. He believed that a just society should not tolerate extreme disparities in wealth and opportunity. One of Mill's most controversial economic positions was his support for inheritance taxes as a means of redistributing wealth. He argued that large inheritances allowed wealth to be passed down without effort, reinforcing social inequalities across generations. By imposing taxes on large estates, he believed the government could reduce economic disparities and create a more meritocratic society. While his views on inheritance taxation were not widely accepted in his time, they later became central to debates on wealth distribution and progressive taxation. Mill's economic philosophy also extended to his views on population control and resource sustainability. Influenced by Thomas Malthus's theories on population growth, Mill was concerned that unchecked population expansion could outstrip economic resources, leading to widespread poverty. However, unlike Malthus, who largely saw this as an inevitable crisis, Mill believed that education and social reforms, particularly regarding birth control and women's rights, could help regulate population growth in a way that ensured long-term economic stability. His emphasis on sustainable economic policies was ahead of his time and remains relevant in contemporary discussions of environmental economics. Another major theme in Mill's economic thought was free trade and globalization. He strongly supported the removal of tariffs and trade barriers, arguing that open markets encouraged economic efficiency and innovation. However, he also acknowledged that free trade alone was not a sufficient solution to economic injustice. He warned that unrestricted capitalism could lead to exploitation, particularly in colonial territories, where European powers often extracted wealth without regard for local populations. His nuanced position on trade and economic justice anticipated later debates on globalization and ethical economics. Mill's influence on economic policy extended beyond Britain, shaping debates in Europe and the United States. His ideas were studied by reformers who sought to balance the principles of a market economy with a need for social protections. He was particularly influential among progressive thinkers who believed in using economic policies to promote democracy and social well-being. His work provided an intellectual foundation for later economic reforms, including welfare programs, labor protections, and progressive taxation. John Stuart Mill's life was a tapestry of intellectual achievement, social reform, and political activism. When he died in 1873, he left behind a profound legacy that would shape philosophy, politics, economics, and social thought for generations to come. His contributions to liberal philosophy, his advocacy for individual rights, and his work on democracy and gender equality continue to influence modern thinkers and movements. Mill's ideas, while rooted in the social and political context of the 19th century, remain surprisingly relevant to contemporary debates on liberty, justice, and equality. Mill's most enduring legacy lies in his defense of individual liberty. His 1859 essay on liberty remains one of the foundational texts in liberal thought. In it, Mill argued that the role of government should be limited, allowing individuals to pursue their own happiness and self-development as long as their actions did not harm others. This principle, known as the harm principle, has had a lasting impact on liberal philosophy and has been applied to a wide range of issues, from free speech to drug legalization to questions of personal autonomy and medical ethics. Mill's insistence that society must protect individual freedom from the tyranny of both the state and the majority resonates with current political movements that emphasize civil liberties and personal rights. Another aspect of Mill's legacy is his pioneering work on gender equality. His book, The Subjection of Women, was ahead of its time in advocating for the full emancipation of women. Though Mill did not live to see women's suffrage in Britain or the United States, his arguments provided intellectual support for the feminist movements that would emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His call for women's education, property rights, and political participation laid the groundwork for the eventual expansion of women's rights. Modern feminist theorists continue to draw on Mill's ideas, especially his belief that true equality could only be achieved if women were free to make their own choices, both within the family and in society at large. Mill's views on democracy and political participation also remain influential. He was an ardent proponent of political engagement, not just as a theoretical ideal, but as a practical necessity for the flourishing of a just society. His support for universal suffrage, his ideas on the education of voters, and his belief in the importance of diverse viewpoints in public discourse continue to inform debates on democratic participation today. Mill's emphasis on the value of dissent and free speech within a democratic society has become a cornerstone of liberal thought. His arguments on liberty are frequently cited in discussions of censorship, media regulation, and the protection of minority voices in democratic societies. Mill's economic thought, especially his views on economic justice and the distribution of wealth, had a significant impact on both liberal and socialist thinkers. While he supported the free market, he also believed that government intervention was necessary to correct social inequalities. His ideas about cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, and land reform influenced the development of both cooperative movements and the broader discourse on economic democracy. In the 20th century, his support for progressive taxation and the redistribution of wealth would be echoed in the policies of social democratic governments. His nuanced view of capitalism, which recognized its potential while calling for reforms to address its excesses, remains a valuable framework for addressing modern issues of inequality and corporate power. In addition to his economic and political ideas, Mill's philosophical contributions continue to be foundational. As a leading figure in the utilitarian tradition, he helped to refine the ideas of his predecessors, particularly Jeremy Bentham. Mill's version of utilitarianism, with its emphasis on the quality of pleasure over the quantity, represented a more sophisticated approach to ethical decision-making than the original, more mechanistic form of the theory. His ideas about the greater good and how to balance individual freedom with social responsibility have influenced ethical frameworks in areas ranging from public health to environmental policy. Mill's work on ethics and moral philosophy remains a critical part of modern discussions on the balance between personal autonomy and social obligations. Mill's influence also extends to social reform. His advocacy for women's rights, workers' rights, and educational access set the stage for progressive movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The labor movement, in particular, found resonance in Mill's arguments for worker ownership and fair wages, which would later shape the policies of social democratic governments. His ideas also influenced debates on education reform, particularly in regard to the expansion of public education and the elimination of barriers to intellectual and vocational training. His belief in social justice and the ability of government to intervene in the economy to correct injustices is an idea that has influenced welfare policies around the world. Mill's legacy is not without its complexities. While he is celebrated for his commitment to individual liberty, democracy, and equality, some of his views, such as his support for plural voting, where educated individuals would have more votes than others, have been criticized for their elitism. Mill's complex stance on imperialism also remains a point of debate. While he criticized the abuses of colonial powers and recognized the rights of colonized peoples, he believed that British colonialism could have a civilizing mission, a view that is controversial in today's post-colonial context. Nevertheless, these complexities do not diminish the broader significance of his work, but rather provide a fuller picture of a thinker who was both of his time and ahead of it. Mill's personal life also contributed to his intellectual legacy. His early experiences, particularly his rigorous education under the tutelage of his father, James Mill, shaped his lifelong commitment to intellectual rigor and rationality. His partnership with Harriet Taylor, both personal and intellectual, significantly influenced his views on social justice and equality. Though their relationship was unconventional by the standards of their time, it represented Mill's belief in the importance of mutual respect and intellectual companionship in marriage. Their relationship underscores the personal dimension of Mill's philosophical work, highlighting his deep conviction that ideas must be lived, not just theorized. In the years following his death, Mill's influence continued to spread through academic institutions, political movements, and social reforms. His works remain standard readings in philosophy and political science departments around the world, and his ideas continue to shape the way we think about freedom, justice, and human rights. His impact on the liberal tradition, particularly in the context of contemporary discussions on individual rights and democracy, is undeniable. His work has inspired not only philosophers but also activists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens who seek to create a more just and equitable society. John Stuart Mill's life and work offer a profound testament to the power of ideas to shape history. His defense of individual liberty, his advocacy for gender equality, and his commitment to social justice resonate as strongly today as they did in the 19th century. Mill's vision of a society where individuals are free to pursue their own happiness, as long as they do not harm others, remains one of the most compelling frameworks for thinking about human flourishing in the modern world. His legacy, therefore, is not just in the theories he developed, but in the continued application of those theories to the ongoing struggles for justice and equality in our societies.